Hello everyone and welcome to Press TV's news review program where we get in depth in one of the day's top stories. Iran's ambassador to the United Nations says that sanctions violate basic principles of human rights, including the right to development. Majid Takhtravanchi said the sanctions prevent governments from accessing executive means to achieve progress and development. He was speaking at the UN General Assembly's Economic and Financial Committee. The envoy slammed U.S. unilateral measures as well as the world community's inaction in the face of such behavior. Takhtravanchi noted that coercive U.S. measures are targeting health systems of countries still grappling with the coronavirus pandemic. He stressed that those illegal measures hamper not only development goals but also constitute a crime against humanity. Joining us now for the program is Mr. Jim Kavanaugh, founder of the Polemicist.net from New York, and Ramiro Fuentes, journalist and political commentator, joining us from Los Angeles, California. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program. Jim, I guess we'll start with you. Hope you're safe and doing well. Your initial thoughts on crippling sanctions, basically an obstacle to a country's development, and basically which constitutes a standard of well-being for humans that these countries are denied and these people are denied.
Yes, this has become the standard American way of doing non-business, I guess you'd say, in the world. I mean, the countries that the United States doesn't like, they institute a program of economic siege warfare against them. And the sanctions are meant to create social problems and economic problems for the people of the country that the United States hopes will inspire them to rise up against the government. That rarely happens. It just hurts the people of the country, and it hurts their social and economic situation. So, this is a standard policy of the United States now. That's the way they try and get their goals in the world, is through, if it's not military action directly, it's through economic siege warfare. And Iran is one of their prime targets. I did see that they lifted a couple of sanctions today on a couple of Iranian companies. So maybe they want to try and get the Iranians back into the negotiations and push that forward. Although I'm very skeptical about that. But this is the standard operating procedure for the United States now: economic siege warfare.
Thank you, Jim, and Ramiro. Welcome to the program. Hope you're doing well out there in Los Angeles. And Ramiro, it's not just Iran, is it? There's a handful of countries that their civilian populations are crippled and don't really have the right to the kind of standard of living in other countries, and people that are completely apolitical, but they're being bludgeoned by these sanctions.
That's exactly right. And just as the other guests mentioned as well, these sanctions hurt poor working class people the most. Iran is one of the hardest hit with sanctions impacting working class families, women, children, families struggling to pay their bills, survive. It impacts infrastructure, it impacts the ability of a nation to develop its economy, and it forms part of the broader strategy of hybrid warfare, where sanctions and corporate news media are used together to demonize any country or system that is opposed to Wall Street and London. And so what it does is that it creates the problem. It brands Iran, it brands Venezuela, it brands Cuba, Nicaragua, DPRK as so-called state sponsors of terror, even though these are the countries that are on the front lines of fighting terrorism. And so it does a complete inversion of reality. It creates the economic problems in those countries by implementing sanctions, by prohibiting companies from trading with Iran, with all these different nations. And then it blames those problems that are created on the policies of the government as opposed to the sanctions themselves. So there's so many levels to this hybrid warfare. It's psychological, it's mediatic, and that's why it's important for us here at Press TV to have these conversations, because people oftentimes divorce sanctions from real life warfare, and it is an act of warfare.
And Jim, do you think that the U.S. will ever get to a point where it actually finds other ways to poke and prod a government that it does not like, rather than take its wrath out on the people of that population? Basically, do you think we'll get to a point where the U.S. will rethink its sanctions and see the lack of humanity in its sanctions regime?
Short answer, no. The United States, unless there's a kind of radical, not to say revolutionary upheaval in the political structure of the United States, is going to pursue this. They have policies, in regions, and they've been doing this for decades. I mean, the CIA wrote about it in Venezuela, that this is our goal is to destroy the economy. The UN rapporteur for Venezuela said this is crime against humanity. This is siege warfare. It's a crime against humanity. And they are these regimes that the United States doesn't like for whatever reason, because they're too socialistic, or have social democratic policies, or because they don't, they're resistant to Israeli hegemony in the case of Iran. Unless the United States changes its priorities in that respect, then they're going to continue doing this, because what else do they have to do? They're a little more reluctant to go in with troops right away. So this is the other weapon that they have, and it's a very powerful weapon for poor countries. Now, there are alliances and economic alliances that are growing that will be the way of defeating this. Iran has had relationships with Venezuela and will give them oil, and won't pay attention to Iran is giving or selling oil to Lebanon and bringing it in. So these are things that and China and Russia will have relations with these countries and won't abide by the American sanctions. It's the Europeans who are the poodles in this, and who refuse, as they are doing with the JCPOA, to break away from the American orders, which are to sanction everybody the United States wants.
Thank you, Jim. And Ramiro, your final thoughts, please.
I think the way out of this mess, the situation, is to create a new anti-imperialist bloc, unity. I'm pleased to know that Iran has been cooperating and trading more with China, with Venezuela, with Nicaragua, with Cuba, building an alternative to the World Trade Organization, to the IMF, to the World Bank, to Wall Street. Because once you build that alternative, and by the way, that means not only in the financial sector, but also in terms of social media, a new Facebook, a new Twitter, a new Instagram, creating an alternative to the empire-run infrastructure, that is the way out of this mess. And I think that Iran and so many other countries that have been sanctioned, that is number one on their priority, moving away from the dollar, moving away from the control of Wall Street and London. And I think that I am very positive and optimistic about the future of this anti-imperialist bloc.
All right, gentlemen, thank you both for joining us on the program. Jim Kavanaugh joining us out of New York, and Ramiro Fuentes joining us from Los Angeles, California. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's News Review program. Thanks for joining us, and goodbye for now.